In our gospel this Sunday, St. Mark tells us the story of the woman with the 2 copper coins who's placing her last 2 small coins into the treasury, and Jesus sits and observes and teaches his apostles what this means. I'm sure we're familiar enough with the story, maybe too familiar with the story, and maybe we even have come to the conclusion that we know what it means. But it wouldn't ever hurt us to listen one more time to see if there's something else that Jesus is telling us. I'm sure you've heard it many times associated with our stewardship efforts in the church. You probably would agree that it's probably overused in that context. But so tempting, right? Because Abraham gave 10% of what he had to the priest Melchizedek when Melchizedek blessed him. But this woman that Jesus holds out does so much more than Abraham. She gives 100%. She gives everything. So it's very convenient as we're filling out our pledge cards to have just read this story of the woman who gives everything. Probably Jesus was not teaching about stewardship, and he certainly wasn't talking about finances. I've heard it expressed and reflected to my own benefit that this is a teaching about trust. You'll notice that all of the other people throwing their money into the brass horns of the treasury, and listening to the coins make their way down and hit the box at the bottom, that they were all wealthy men. This woman has no man anymore. She's a widow. She has no wealth anymore. Her last 2 coins, not the last 2 coins for the week, right? Not the last 2 coins for the month. She doesn't have any source of new income anymore. And she takes her last 2 coins to her name, and she gives them to God, as if to say, God, I trust you. I trust myself to you. I have no one else to lean on. The widow Saraphat also, right? Her last bread and her last flour and oil that she gives to the prophet. Maybe an act of desperation, but also an act of trust. I would suggest that while this is true and very much in the line of Jesus' teaching, that there's a lot more at play here in this story. Because Mark situates this story in Jerusalem in that last week, that Holy Week, in which Jesus enters his city, makes his last powerful teachings, enters into great conflict with the leaders, and ultimately is condemned and beaten and killed and raised from the dead. Like, this is the context of the story. And as we hear this story, in this context, we can't help but think that as Jesus sits in the temple and observes and prays and teaches, his mind has already wandered to the end of the week when he will be called to give everything. And he's talking to his apostles, to those who would follow him, not just about how they're supposed to spend their money, not just about how they're supposed to trust God, but about how they're supposed to live the calling that they have in life, about how they're supposed to live their vocation, about what it means to follow him, about what it means to be a Christian, about what this mission of love requires. And he finds an example of someone who doesn't give a lot. He finds the example of someone who gives everything. And sometimes we give a lot, but Jesus didn't notice any of them. He noticed the woman who gave everything. And again, when we think about giving everything, we're not talking about giving everything to the soup kitchen. We're not talking about giving everything to the parish. We're not talking about giving everything to the missions. We're talking about giving everything our whole lives to the call that we've received. For many of us, maybe that call is exercised with children or a spouse. And giving everything is demanding, and you know that demand. And sometimes we'd like to hold something back. We'd like to keep some reserves. And Jesus says that it's better to give everything, to give all that we have. Our vocations come in a lot of different, along a lot of different paths. They take on a lot of different expressions. They accomplish a lot of different things. But all of them, if they're a vocation from God, accomplish the mission of making God's love present in our world. And for us to live that mission, for us to embrace that call, we have to give everything. And this woman and her 2 little copper coins did more good by giving everything, even if everything was just a little bit. Sometimes we think it would be better to give a bunch. Jesus reminds us that that's not the goal, that love doesn't require a bunch. Even if it's just a little, love requires everything. And we're invited maybe to reaffirm our vocation, to reconsider God's call, to see in the circumstances and realities of our life where we're called to give everything, maybe to acknowledge where we're still holding something back, and make a real effort this week to be a little bit more like the woman with her 2 little coins, and with her to place everything at the service of the mission, to place everything at the service of love, to be with Jesus at the end of the week on the cross, placing everything at the service of mission, placing everything at the service of love.